Okie dokie, everybody. Here we go. We are going live on Facebook and Instagram this morning for another round of Astro-Babble. Yay! Had to take a quick break because we didn't have enough charts in the queue. So I posted and everybody's sending in lots of charts. So now the queue is like super active again. Yay! Let's go ahead and go over some of the rules. We have a queue that's been sent to me by everybody on social media, on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you all for donating your charts. All I need, if you would like to be in the queue, is your birth date, place, and exact birth time. I do need that exact birth time, and I do need you to, when you send in that information, send in the month and the day spelled out, especially for those of you overseas. It just gets really confusing when the month and day are backwards because I'm in the US and I need it where I can type it into my system and not get the month and the day mixed up. Yeah, so I would love to feature your chart. Good morning, Raven. Good morning, everybody jumping on. Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for jumping on. Yes, I'm getting all the likes and messages already. I appreciate you very, very much. Yes, let's continue to go. We have 8 charts. We're doing 8 charts, and I'll probably do a couple days in a row until we run out. So feel free to send in your charts and let's get to it. Let's pop open some fizzy water and get to it. Okay. First chart of the morning is Crystal. Crystal was born 5:14 p.m. in Clearwater. Let's go ahead and take a look at Crystal. Oh, lovely. So we have the ascendant in Cancer at 0 degrees. Very, very important that we get the time of that birth correct. With an ascendant, it's literally 0 degrees, 19 clicks in. Like it's so, so close to being either a Gemini to being a Gemini ascendant. So we really need to be specific about 5:14 on the dot because 1 minute before or after that, and the chart totally shifts. But having a Cancer ascendant and having the moon in Cancer in the first house is a lovely thing. Definitely gets a double dose of that mama energy from that Cancer archetype, and the moon being full as well, opposing her sun in Capricorn in the 7th, which we have a little bit of an issue with. But just the idea that we have that full moon in the first house of self, there's a lot of lunar energy here. There's a lot of maternal energy here. There's a lot of water energy here for both the ascendant and the moon, 2 markers that are key to the personality being in that first house of self. Full moons are not necessarily a good thing when it comes to natal charts. Full moons and new moons tend to be a little bit tricky. If you would like to learn about your lunar placement, you can always purchase the Interpreting Your Moon class via my website, scorpiorisingastrology.com. But when we see the moon at its fullness, that also heightens the emotions because the moon is our emotional planet. Especially putting that in the first house with Crystal, emotions might tend to get out of control, and that's something that we just need to be very, very aware of because it's part of the identity is that wishy-washy, watery nature, which can be kind of self-smothering to a certain degree. Because the moon is opposing the sun during a full moon, that means that the emotions naturally conflict with the ego. So again, full moon's not necessarily the best for somebody who already has a lot of water in their chart. A Capricorn sun will bring a level of practicality into it, but we just need to be aware that the light that would be shining is often outshone by the moon in charts like this. So the emotional self might take over the egoic self, which is not necessarily ideal for balance. We always want to see balance in a chart. So when we look at the seventh house of relationships containing Crystal's sun, her Neptune, as well as her Venus, all in Capricorn, Neptune in the 7th house does bring a little bit of that unpredictable energy to the 7th house of relationships. It's not something that I like to see in the 7th house, but it does provide this archetype. So it means that spouses will need to have a certain level of spirituality to kind of play this game and ride this ride with Crystal. If they don't have that heightened sense of spirituality, basically, if they're not a king of the fairy realm, they're not going to play in Crystal's sandbox, and that's kind of what we see with Neptune on a higher expression. Lower expression, Neptune does rule addiction issues, it does rule chemical sensitivity, and it does rule this kind of in-between nature where people are flowing in and out of what we would term normal consciousness. So partners on the negative side might be a little bit delusional, as a good way to say it. And we need to transmute that into a higher sense of spirituality, but not get lost in that spirituality as well. Because the sun is in the seventh house, and over identification with a spouse or relationship is part of the makeup with crystals. So we need to understand that although the Cancer ascendant really feeds into this, and the moon being there, like you wanting to give everything to the person that you spend your life with, you also need to have a life of your own. You can't sacrifice your journey for theirs in order to support them, which I know for anybody with prominent Cancer placements watching, that just breaks your little heart. And I get it because I have those placements, but it's just something that you need to hear. But we also have Mars in Scorpio, as well as Pluto in Scorpio, and the South Node in Scorpio, all in the fifth house of children. That is a spicy child, Crystal. That is a very powerful child that you are rearing up. To have Pluto, a planet that is no, and to have it in its secondary ruled sign of Scorpio, like that's massive when we put that in the fifth house of children and parents. The South Node here does indicate that a lot of your energy tends to be lost in this area. So you might find, although you are an excellent mother by nature, because that ascendant and that moon in the first house really bring out those Cancer qualities of maternity. Unfortunately, it's a lot more energy than you expected to spend when it comes to child rearing. That South Node, wherever we find the South Node, is kind of the energy suck of the chart, and for you, it's in that fifth house of family and children and that kind of stuff. Mars and Scorpio here really adds that spy energy to the fifth house of parents and children. So Mars likes to be in Aries because it's a more outwardly aggressive expression of that Mars. But Mars in Scorpio is more of that ninja, like the assassin that's trained to lurk in the shadows. And that's the energy that you brought into that space of parents and children. So that's fun. That's great. Let's look at the sixth house of work. You've got 3 planets here, 3 planets there. Like you've really decided to stack things into the fifth house with 3, the sixth house with 3, the seventh house with 3. That sixth house is a little bit complicated because we've got that Saturn in Sag, we've got Mercury in Sag, we've got Uranus in Sag. We've got a lot of very interesting placements for the sixth house of work, health, and pets. Saturn in the health house is not always going to be ideal. It's in the sign of the liver as well as the hips. So we might find some structural leg and vascular issues in Crystal, specifically with the legs being weak, the hips being weak, which might turn into low back or knee problems. Mercury in Sagittarius as well, from a medical perspective in that sixth house of health, does indicate blood sugar fluctuations. We also have Uranus here, which would indicate blood sugar fluctuations due to Sagittarius being the sign of the liver. So there's a lot of physical things that we need to be aware of with these placements in the sixth house. But from a work perspective, that sixth house in Sagittarius is being ruled by Jupiter in Aquarius up in the 8th of death, of accounting, of taxes, of business. So we have this natural entrepreneurial streak that Crystal has in her chart, very good working with clients, especially after age 30 when that Saturn in her 6th matures. And we do have the North Node in the 11th being ruled by Venus in Capricorn in the 7th. So that North Node is really, when we look at North Node placement, which will always oppose the South Node, it's where the eclipses would take place at the time of your birth, if you were born during eclipse. But just at that time, it's where the eclipses were taking place. We look at the North Node and we see that it's where somebody's headed. It's where their life is kind of taking them. And for Venus to rule that in the 7th, really it's about mastering relationships this time around for Crystal. Mastering relationships intimately, but also friendship-wise, because that North Node in Taurus is in the 11th house of friendships, communities, and greater social activities, which I think is not necessarily a hard jump for somebody with a Cancer ascendant with that full moon. Okie dokie. That's a good chunk about Crystal's chart. Good morning, everybody who's jumping into the chat on Instagram and Facebook. Hello, hello, Kay, Mary, Jillian, Fatima, everybody who's jumping on Instagram as well. I appreciate you. So we are just going through 8 charts. Everybody's really, really enjoying it. I'm really enjoying it. So let's continue. Let's continue on, shall we, with our second chart of the morning. Alejandra was born 9:15 a.m. in Mexico City. Let's go ahead and take a look at Alejandra's chart. Ooh, I love it. I love it. Right off the bat, Jupiter right on the ascendant. Fabulous. Jupiter is in Capricorn, though, so the sign of its detriment, a restricted Jupiter. A restricted Jupiter being ruled by Saturn in the 6th. That indicates some weakness. Weakness in a specific area, like because 6th house is work. One of your kryptonites, Alejandra, is people trying to pull power plays at work. Specifically people who are in authoritarian positions who are trying to suppress your natural talents. Those natural talents which would be related to writing, teaching, communication, as well as the 12th house topics of hospitalization, death, and helping people through karmic transition. Second not okay thing with self-esteem, we have the sun in Sagittarius in the 12th. So we've talked about this on previous videos, but when the sun is in the 12th house is hidden. The 12th house is a place where things go to die in the chart, and it's something before there. It's right on that horizon at the time of birth. It's that transition place between living and dead. And when we find the sun here, the sun is that planet of ego. We want the ego to be strong. We want the ego to be vibrant. We want the ego to be lush. And instead, we find it here in the 12th house, conjunct Neptune in that 12th house. So that's a little bit tough for the personality. The personality fractures easily because Neptune is conjoining the sun. Again, the idea of Neptune bringing chemical issues to the surface, being very hypersensitive to medication, being very affected by things like alcohol, caffeine, potential addiction issues, things like that. We just need to be aware of that. But that Jupiter on the ascendant is still pretty lucky, even though it's in a detrimental place and it's being ruled by that house of work and health and pets. It's still in a spot where it can touch the ascendant. We have the North Node here in the 1st house. So I think part of Alejandra's work this go around, at least, is really to figure out who she is, why she is, and what is it that she represents in the world. Reclaiming that sense of self is a good way to think about Alejandra's chart. One of the ways that she might actually find some emotional fulfillment is in that 9th house of travel, higher education, and foreigners. She's got her moon up here in Virgo, being ruled by Mercury retrograde in Sag in the 12th. So when it comes to emotional fulfillment, and there are different kinds of fulfillment that astrology talks about. Fulfillment of the emotions, because the moon is in that 9th house, we find that she's eager to travel. We find that she's always looking to interact with foreign cultures. She resonates with the heart of a lot of these foreign cultures. And she might even study them. However, because Mercury is retrograde in the 12th and is ruling that moon, she might come to harm either at college or while traveling. We just need to be aware that that's a little bit of a rough spot for the ruler of the 9th to be, again, in that place of hidden enemies, that place of not necessarily safety in the chart. We do have Mars in Scorpio and Venus in Scorpio up in the 11th. That's really interesting, Alejandra. You keep very interesting bedfellows and friends. When we look at the 11th house, rather, of friendships and social groups, the flavor of Alejandra's social groups have that Scorpio tendency. So people who are naturally into the occult, people who are naturally into the underbelly of life, people who are naturally into the dark side of the world, who are very mysterious and wear leather jackets and sunglasses at night and all of that fun stuff. But because we have Mars and Venus here, we know that gender really plays no role in Alejandra's friend selection. She gets along very evenly with both men and women. Although, when it comes to Venus and Scorpio here in the 11th, Venus and Scorpio is in its detriment. It's not necessarily the space that, or rather in its fall. Venus in its fall in Scorpio in the 11th talks about maybe female friends being a little bit more difficult, female friends being a little bit more catty, female friends being a little bit more poisonous or vindictive. Mars and Scorpio, naturally, the men that Alejandra attracts in her social circles are very, very powerful, but very subversive. Again, Mars and Scorpio being that ninja archetype, people who shroud themselves in a veil of mystery. And I think that that's one of the things that really compounds Alejandra's chart about manifesting who she is as a person, being one of the things that she's supposed to be tackling in this life. She surrounds herself with people, places, and things that really force her to dig into the personality. What makes you you? You're hiding from me is something that she'll always tell her friends. But part of that dialogue is to really help her expose her true nature, which is a little bit more difficult for her to put her finger on. So from a chart perspective, we really look at all of this hiddenness in the 11th and all of this hiddenness in the 12th, really compounding that North Node in Capricorn in the first, where her self-discovery is the most prominent part of her life lesson this go around. Because we have the ruler of the chart being Saturn in the 6th house of health, and we have Saturn in Gemini, being ruled by Mercury in the 12th as well. One of the things that Alejandra would actually be very, very good at is working in a hospital setting, working with hospice. Also because her sun in the 12th is ruling the 8th of death. There's a lot of that kind of in between that she understands. She's able to navigate people who are on the edge of life very, very well, and she's able to comfort them in a way that she can't comfort normal people. And that's something that, when I say that to certain clients, they're like, what do you mean? Do you mean I'm weird or not normal? I'm like, define normal for me, honey, because being normal is vastly overrated. And I think that your skills, Alejandra, specifically are utilized in the hospice space and utilized in the caregiving space in a way that really allows you to make fast friends, and to work with clients on a level that people who aren't touched by that liminal space won't understand. Yeah. Good stuff. Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. I appreciate it. Yes, Lena, Christine, Jennifer, thank you so much. Helen, everybody who's jumping on, I appreciate the gallery, as it were. We're going through our charts. I'm running a little bit slow this morning, so we've got. Let's move on to not that one. Let's move on to Jillian. Jillian is third in our queue. Jillian was born 9:18 a.m. in Putnam. Let's go ahead and take a look at Jillian. Wow, that's the third chart where Neptune plays a really strong role. I think we need to talk about Neptune for a bit. So Neptune, right now, Jillian has Sagittarius ascendant, but Neptune is right here at 23 degrees. Her ascendant's at 17, but it's still in that first house of self. So very close to her identity. Neptune is a great analogy that I like to talk about with Neptune is it's the fairy world. It's not here, it's not there, it's kind of in between. You can't find it if you were looking for it. It's covered with sparkles and everybody's dressed really elegantly, but it's not real. It's not part of the real world. And oftentimes the fairies are accused of stealing, specifically children, from the real world and trapping them in the fairy world where they can't escape. Now they're surrounded by the best food, the best clothes, the best everything, and they live a life of luxury as a fairy pet. But when we think of fairy energy as being sparkly and delicious and elegant, but also not of the physical world and potentially dangerous to the physical world, because you can't operate in the fairy realm and the human realm easily, right? It takes a lot of energy to maintain those two connections and not lose yourself. That's what Neptune does, is it makes us kind of lose ourselves in that whimsy. And whenever we find Neptune on the ascendant, that's part of the issue, is escapism, is addiction, is chemical sensitivities, is wanting to escape or feeling like you are part of a world that is not this one. Yeah. And constantly being lost in that space. So that's kind of part of when we find Neptune very close to the ascendant, close to the sun, close to the moon in some cases. We need to respect that Neptune playing a role in the chart brings an air of that mystical, that whimsical, that not necessarily here, that very ephemeral touch, which can make it distracting to live as a normal human, a human. We do have a stellium up in Libra, up in the 11th. That's fun. So we have Mercury in Libra, Jupiter in Libra, which is the lord of the chart. Oh, exactly conjoined at 25 degrees, Pluto in Libra and Saturn in Libra, the sign of its exaltation, which is excellent, as well as the MC in Libra. Fun. So let's talk about Libra stelliums. So Libra stelliums, we've talked about a couple of videos back, the idea of somebody with a Libra stellium having this social justice warrior energy to them, especially with that being in the 12th house. Things that are fair, very, very important to Jillian. The idea of power dynamics being something that Jillian constantly has to navigate, especially in her friendship circles. Wouldn't surprise me. Well, I can't necessarily say that because we haven't gotten into work or career, but she might even be famous for social activism, because that Mercury in Libra conjoining Pluto, conjoining Jupiter, is ruling that 10th house of success. So that Mercury giving us communication, that Jupiter just making things really big, Pluto giving us power, Saturn giving us authority and restriction, ruling that 10th house of career and success, with Mars present in Virgo in the 10th. There's a lot of energy where Jillian, like, I can see where that Neptune comes in handy, because you fantasize about the ideal. You fantasize about what it's like when everything goes right, and you're terribly upset when things don't. And so part of your mission here is to fight for the ideal. And I think that you identify very heavily with people who struggle because you have this sun in Scorpio in the 12th, which again puts that ego into that 12th house of hidden enemies, that place of self-sabotage, where we find, a lot of the weakness that you see out in the world resonates with you very, very strongly. And part of your escapism into the fantasy, I think the challenge will be to take that fantasy and manifest it into reality through your social activism, through your circles, through your tribe, and really working with people who are able to make that change. Not necessarily yourself, but could be working with other authority figures, power figures, especially when it comes to communication, where you're able to kind of bend the ear of those of influence. Yeah, that's really creepily interesting, how born with that Pluto, Jupiter, Mercury conjunction in the 11th in Libra, all at 25 degrees. That's a powerful placement, Jillian. Again, I would not underestimate your ability to speak and to be heard. Yeah, especially with that Saturn in Libra ruling that 3rd house of communication, writing, teaching. You might even do some of this community activism work with your siblings, with your cousins, with your kind of outer relative circle. So there's a lot of power here, Jillian, a lot of untapped power in the 11th house of friendships. But when it comes to the moon is being ruled by Jupiter. The moon is down in Pisces in the 4th. So we have this homebody tendency, the idea of the 4th house of family containing the moon, our emotional planet. There's a recharge that happens in the home that Jillian can't really find anywhere else. And I think that really complements the activism side to Jillian's chart, because that Jupiter is also connected to that 4th house moon. But that moon is ruling the North Node in the 8th house of business, of estates, of taxes. Yeah, that's a fun placement, because then we've got the finances that are roped into that as well. That Saturn in Libra also ruling the 2nd house of finances, with Venus here in Capricorn. There's a lot of very interesting connections between estates, between family. There's almost this soap opera that's kind of unfurling before my eyes as I look into this chart, Jillian. You've got all of this tremendous power, this clear plot line, this very, very intense skill set that you've come into this life with. But then you have all of these kind of external circumstances that are trying to weave the web of what it is that you're supposed to do. And I think it's really easy to get lost in that, because you constantly have other people pushing and pulling you in different directions, and all you really want is a piece of the pie for yourself, despite you being so selfless. And that can be an interesting kind of mode, especially because that north and south node are squaring exactly at 25 degrees. Goodness, girl, we need to sit down with your chart a little bit more. There's a lot happening here for sure. That's crazy town, having the north and south node, those two opposite points of where you're going versus where you have been, past life versus future life, squaring that 25-degree triple conjunction with Pluto, Jupiter, and Mercury. That's some intense energy and confliction in terms of where you think you should go versus where you've been, and how money is connected into all that. It's just it's kind of like a big mobster soap opera, really. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, Jillian. But as long as you stay on that Libra track, as long as you really investigate social connections, use your power for social justice, and create space in humanitarian efforts, that's really where your chart seems to shine. Excellent. Thank you, Sally. I appreciate that. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, Helen, everybody who's jumping on Facebook as well as Instagram. I think Instagram actually froze, unfortunately. So we will continue on via Facebook and post it on YouTube for those of you if Instagram is still working. Okay, next chart up. Oh, yes, we have the fabulous, the wonderful, the multi-talented, the absolutely incredulous Kim. Kim is here, and she is born at 2:49 p.m. in Kenosha. Yes, Kim. Let's talk about Kim. So Kim has a Sagittarius ascendant, seems to be the theme. She also has South Node here. South Node here in the first house brings an energy suck to the personality. So Kim's already right out of the gate has an energy suck in her first house of self. The idea that the personality might be very draining to her. She can't keep up with her own tendencies, that sort of thing. But we find that node, that South Node and that ascendant, ruled by Jupiter and Taurus in the 6th. She is a workaholic. She is somebody who personally identifies with her work situation as who she is as a person. And that's what we see when the Lord of the Ascendant is in the 6th. Somebody who really finds personal structure via their daily tasks as well, especially with Taurus being here. It's that I must do this thing. I must wake up same time. I must eat the same thing for breakfast. I must be to work at this time. I must take my lunch at this time. I must do this. I must do that. And the laundry list of to-dos is really how we keep a lot of that personality in check with Kim, because whenever Jupiter rules the chart via the first house, there's always going to be an expanded sense of personality. That Jupiter and Taurus in the 6th does bring us a little bit of a health concern with thyroid and metabolism, especially with Neptune in Scorpio opposing it over in the 12th via sign. So the idea that food and or substances might rock Kim's metabolism a little bit more than they would most people. We also have a stellium up in the 10th house in Virgo, the sign of the small intestine, including Mercury retrograde here. So we have malabsorption via the small intestine, which then affects the thyroid, and Jupiter tending towards hypothyroid, that expansion of the thyroid. When we look at that chart dynamic. Jupiter tends to make things big, but when we look at Taurus ruling thyroid, it's not necessarily making the thyroid big, although it could, because hypothyroid then tends to enlarge because it overreacts and creates extra. Let's see. We have the moon in Gemini in the 7th, opposing the ascendant. Loosely by 3 degrees, but still there. So moon in Gemini is fun. That's the best way I can think about it. It's just fun. It's a fun placement. Moon in Gemini makes a person very emotionally flitty, being able to experience both the highs and the lows within a couple minutes. It's just a roller coaster ride emotionally, especially with Mercury retrograde up in the 10th, ruling the moon. We have another connection to work, to career, to entrepreneurship, with the moon being ruled by the 10th house planet. So that's fun. Yeah, everything seems to be pointing back to that Mercury retrograde. So when we find Mercury in a chart, Mercury tends to rule the flavor of the mind. It tends to rule part of our ability to communicate. It tends to rule our thought process, which is normally really good. And indeed, when we have Mercury in Virgo, Mercury loves to be in Virgo. It's in its exaltation in Virgo. But we do have Mercury in Virgo retrograde, so it is going backwards, giving it a little bit of a backwards spin. So that mental activity that's ruling the moon tends to get Kim into more trouble than anything else, possibly because constantly thinking about work, constantly thinking about the next thing, not giving yourself time to stop mentally and smell the roses. There's always this drive to go, 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 do, next step, next step, next step, next level, got to level up, got to do the thing, because the sun is here in Virgo as well. And that sun being in that 10th house of career success really brings an identification of the ego with that kind of career. Yeah. And that's something that I really like to point out with clients who have a lot of 10th house placements, but also have 6th house leverage as well. Success looks different for everybody. And when we look at the 10th house as representing success, success doesn't necessarily need to be what you do for a living. It's what you're known for. It's your legacy, right? Versus the 6th house is more what you do for work, what you do on a daily basis, the job you show up to day in, day out. So I think from an astrological standpoint, where Kim will find her most important self-stabilizing qualities will be in the daily tasks versus all of this stuff that keeps asking her to play in the 10th house of career success, which potentially gets her in trouble up until about 50. When that Pluto in Virgo matures around 50, there will be this nice grasp on a sense of who she is in relation to that 10th house. Then we have the 8th house of death, taxes, friends, business, having both Venus and Mars here in Cancer. Venus loves to be in Cancer. Mars hates to be in Cancer. Mars is in its fall in Cancer. So we also have Venus ruling the 11th house of friendships and that 6th house of work. Wouldn't be bad for Kim to work around the dead, because that 8th house is that house of death, but also there's that entrepreneurial kick because 8th house is business as well, ruling that 6th house of work. Because Venus is ruling that 11th house of friendships, the idea that friends have passed away at an early age, which has motivated her to kind of put friends as another one of the grounding forces in her life that kind of talk her off of that ledge of hyper productivity. Cool. So that is a little bit about Kim's chart. We are continuing down the line. Thank you everybody for jumping on. There's a lot to cover. We're just over halfway, and we're just over halfway. There's so many charts, so little time. But if you would like to add your chart to the queue, please feel free to submit your birth date, place, and exact birth time. Spell out the birth date and the birth time for me, and send that to me via private messenger. Do not post your birth details in the comments. Or if you'd like to schedule a private session, you can always go to scorpiorisingastrology.com, my website, and book a consult or sign up for a class if you're interested in learning astrology. I have lots of online classes for you to choose from on the signs, the moon, the planets, the houses, soon to be aspects. That'll be a new class that I will be releasing very shortly. Okay. Let's look at Kathy's chart. Kathy was born at 6:33 a.m. in Los Angeles. Scorpio stellium on the ascendant. Crazy town. Okay, Kathy, here we go. So Scorpio rising, absolutely lovely, but we also have Mars and Scorpio here. So a very intense dose of Scorpio right on the ascendant. And we have the sun here in Scorpio, and we have Neptune here in Scorpio. That's ridiculous. If we could just talk about Scorpio for 2 seconds, everything that Scorpio is, you are. Yeah. So again, underworld tendencies, surrounded by death all the time, loves everything black and mysterious. Can't escape the intuition because the intuition rules everything when it comes to Scorpio. Very detective oriented, piercing gaze. You make people uncomfortable by looking at them too long because you're looking into their soul and they feel that. It's just a thing that we have to work with, Kathy. It's who we are. It's what we do. We make people terribly uncomfortable because we're able to lock pick their deepest secrets when no other sign can. And that becomes a fundamental part of our nature, especially when we have Mars here and the Sun here enclosing on the ascendant. There's such an identification and a personality of Scorpio in your chart that I think it's really important for you to just focus on decoding that sign and what that sign means as relative to your life. Because if you just recognize how much of that you are and how perfect that describes your sense of self, it'll be a lot easier for you to master that personality, that ego. We do have a couple 12th house placements as well. We have the moon in Libra in the 12th, Venus in Libra in the 12th, and Mercury in Libra in the 12th. Venus in Libra is a lovely placement because it's in a sign that it rules. The moon in Libra also here ruled by Venus, great. Mercury in Libra ruled by Venus, also great. However, this is the 12th house of hidden enemies. So the emotions tend to be really where Kathy gets stuck. And that's something where we find a lot with Scorpio energy. People who tend to pack on the Scorpio tend to push their emotions a little bit too deep. The emotions tend to be too hidden, even from them. So it's difficult for them to like see a counselor because the counselor might not be able to see through them unless they have those really intense Scorpio placements. So if you were to seek out some emotional remediation, Kathy, I think learning your working with somebody who has an astrology background or working with somebody with heavy Scorpio placements is going to be right up your alley because they'll get you in a way that a lot of people won't. And that moon in the 12th really speaks towards, again, the emotions being a hidden enemy of sorts. Emotions are lovely. They're very powerful. You have Venus ruling them, so there's a lot of them. They're very they're very well formed. Unfortunately, they're hidden from you. And that's a difficult dynamic because there's so much positivity in the heart space, but the heart space is hidden, it's locked away. A lot of those essential skills are lost in the 12th house and can't be accessed by the first house of self. And it makes it even more difficult because we have Venus in her proper sign and Mars in his proper sign. They're what we call averse. They're one house away, meaning they can't see each other at all, and they're in natural rulership. So it's like you have this internal side of you which is soft and gushy and communicative and lovely and graceful and all of those Venusian qualities, and then you have this outer shell that's very dark and mysterious and potentially sharp and barbed wiry and mystical and all of those things that Neptune, Sun, Ascendant, and Mars in Scorpio bring to the surface. There's just a lot of complicated, if we look at your chart like a lock, there's a lot of internal mechanisms that are just very, very complicated to unpick that lock. And unfortunately, lock picking for yourself isn't really an option with these chart placements. We do have Saturn in the third in Capricorn, another sign in its proper place, or another planet in its proper place. Absolutely great. I love that, Kathy. You've put a lot of your planets in their right signs or ruled by a planet in their right signs. So I think that's really, really nice. But when it comes to Saturn in general, Saturn is that planet that does need time to mature around 30 and then around 58 or 60. That first Saturn return, second Saturn return will unlock your ability to teach, unlock your ability to write, unlock your vocal capabilities, unlock your ability to communicate very well. That's a hidden talent, is whenever we see Saturn in a house, that's going to be the area that people need to really discover those skills over time, unwrap those skills over time. They might be deeper into the self than we would like during the first 30 years of life, but after that next 30, they start to emerge and you start to work with them creatively. And that's all in the writing, teaching, communication space for you, Kathy. Because we have Jupiter Ooh, because we have Jupiter in that fourth house of family in Sagittarius, being ruled by Saturn in the third. Wouldn't surprise me if family was a tricky business for you, Kathy, because we have the South Node here too. Family's an energy suck. It's the area of the chart where you find a lot of weakness. When we look at the fourth house having Jupiter, the potential of the family being big is part of that. But then we also have that fourth house being ruled by Saturn. So feeling like a stranger in your own home, is a big theme for you, Kathy. When we look at this chart, despite being surrounded by so many people, there's always this feeling of, no, they don't get me. Which is difficult to have such a heavy Scorpio influence, and then to have the family house being ruled by Aquarius, which is a naturally distant, aloof, and overly scientific sign. Whenever I see Aquarius on the fourth, there's this sign that even though you're surrounded by love, you don't feel any of it. And that's a tricky family dynamic to be raised in. But I think it really does, and it might have contributed to the separation that you feel in your personality. But when we find the North Node in Leo up in the 10th, being ruled by the Sun in Scorpio, I think there's a lot of really good potential that a lot of these family dynamics and a lot of these personal issues that were created are actually the things that you're supposed to be mastering, the things that you're supposed to be working with, and working with the personality and the self in a way that's very constructive and might even help other people overcome their personal difficulties, especially if you incorporate the writing about your self-transformation journey, documenting your own life, and really working through your problems so that you can help other people work through theirs. Very big trend in your chart. Fabulous. Thank you, everybody. Yes, Kelly, Kay, Kathy, everybody who's jumping on, I appreciate you very, very much. Thanks for watching. If you would like to submit your chart for the queue, just pop me over via private message or birth date, place, and exact time, spell out the month and day. We will add you to the queue. We've got a couple days worth of queue up on via the Facebook and Instagram live posts, but I will get through them as soon as possible. And if you liked your reading and you would like to tip, you can always PayPal Sam at ScorpioRisingAstrology.com, or sign up for a consult, and we can go deeper into those placements. Okay. Now let's talk about Hagar. Hagar was born at 12:45 a.m., very close to Tel Aviv. And let's go ahead and take a look at Hagar's chart. So we have a Pisces ascendant, and we have Saturn in Pisces in the first. So whenever we see Saturn in the first house, Saturn touching the first house of self, Saturn makes the self, the identity, a little bit more shriveled, a little bit more compromised, a little bit more reclusive, a little bit more self-deprecating. Especially because Saturn, from a medical perspective, tends to make things shriveled or not as active. The fact that Saturn in Pisces is in the first house of the body means that it could be very possible early on in life, at birth, or within the first 10 or so years of life, 10 to 16 years of life specifically, that immune issues and immune compromised nature was part of Hagar's physical makeup. Constantly getting sick, like constantly, because the immune system was underdeveloped thanks to Saturn being in that first house, and Pisces ruling the lymphatic and the immune, or massive amounts of swelling due to that as well. Pisces ascendant is a really luscious sign, but when paired with Saturn, tends to bring out almost a Scorpio energy to it. Saturn plus Pisces does definitely echo that Scorpio sentiment of feeling, again, self-deprecating, very restrictive, withholding, emotionally cautious, very withdrawn as the tendency, kind of that turtle that just goes back into its shell as a default. Because that ascendant is being ruled by Jupiter in Taurus in the third, there is a great association with teaching, writing, and communication in Hagar's chart. Jupiter in Taurus, I think, is a lovely placement, because Jupiter in Taurus is that benefic king who brings prosperity to the land, that regent who is truly for the people and provides prosperity. And to see that in the third house, the teaching style is abundant, the teaching style is gracious, the teaching style is humble and practical. We also have Mars and Mercury here in Taurus in the third. So there's a lot of passion when it comes to teaching, writing, communication, and a lot of very quick wit, a lot of mental skill, and a lot of good analogies that can be brought forward via that third house Mercury too. I think that all of those are just really fun. That third house Mars is ruling the moon in Aries in the second, so earning money, good money from teaching is actually part of Hagar's chart. So the more she writes, the more she teaches, the more she speaks, as well as potential connections between siblings and money. That is also part of that dynamic as well. But I'm not telling her anything she doesn't already know. When we find the sun in Gemini in the fourth, that's an interesting placement. It's a very family-oriented placement. The sun in Gemini in the fourth house of family is very much about twins in the family specifically, but being surrounded by all ways, shapes, and forms of relatives and recharging through that over social tendency of that Gemini sun. Hearing people speak around the dinner table in probably multiple different languages due to that Gemini, talking about multiple different subjects, everything raising from uncomfortable politics and social standings to religion and faith to art and music to lots and lots and lots of different things that sun in Gemini will bring up around the family dynamic. But being ruled by the Mercury and Taurus in the third, there's a really strong connection, ego-wise, to the family and especially to spouses. Not spouses, siblings, because the third house also rules siblings, and cousins as well. There's a really strong bond there in Hagar's chart. Because that moon in Aries is ruling that fifth house of creativity, Venus in the fifth house of creativity, as well as the North Node here, there's a lot of creative energy in Hagar's chart, a lot of beauty, a lot of artistic flair. There's a lot of maternal creative energy as well. It wouldn't surprise me if the idea of the mother goddess, feminine body shape, involving art, the idea of supporting female musicians and financially working with that Venus in Cancer in the fifth, that creative feminine mother type energy, and actually earning money from that because the moon is in that second house of finance and having potential secondary career income due to the creative efforts as well, selling works of art or selling what is creatively fostered. Also, there's no more fertile placement than a Venus in Cancer in the fifth house. So children definitely part of the equation. But when we look at Venus in Cancer in the fifth, it's a mama bear energy that does not quit. It's such a wonderful maternal placement that I think Hagar has really brought into her chart. Let's see. Yeah. We've already covered all that stuff. Little bit of an issue with travel. We have that third house of writing, teaching, communication, ruling that ninth house of travel, higher learning and foreigners, but we do have Neptune and Scorpio here. The idea of things when you travel getting lost, getting your assignments mixed up in college, turning things in on the wrong date, either early or late. But Neptune tends to make things, again, muddy, confused, and you've got that in that ninth house of higher education, foreigners, and travel. So just be aware that we need to be extra firm with boundaries, extra firm with scheduling, triple check everything when it comes to your higher education pursuits, your travel, as well as interactions with foreigners, because there's an issue with miscommunication, secrets being kept, or things being elusive to you from an outside perspective. Because we have that Mercury in Taurus ruling the 7th house of relationships, there's also a really good chance that Hagar's significant other would work in the same field that she does, especially in that writing, teaching, communication space. But it's funny, Pluto and Uranus are both here in the 7th in Virgo, meaning that relationships with a spouse are something that she's going to need to learn over the course of her life. It's a longer term lesson. It's not going to be a quick learn, and there's going to be a lot of unpredictability, but that's also what she's attracted to in a partner, is those deep reservoirs of power, that unpredictable nature, that bull that you can't ride easily, that stallion that needs to be tamed. That's a lot of Hagar's spousal energy and relationship energy right there. Yeah, I think that's a good chunk of the chart, as it were. So thank you, Hagar, for submitting yours. We've got 10 minutes left, and I think 2 more charts to go. So let's whip through these. We have Allie. Allie was born 3:04 p.m. in Milwaukee. And we've got a Scorpio ascendant, North Node, and Pluto in Scorpio in that first house. So we've got very, very heavy Scorpio energy in Allie's chart. The idea of being associated with, again, the occult, the underworld, things that are dark and mysterious, divination, magic, not magic with a C, magic with a K, the idea of detective work, piercing gaze, all of the things that Scorpio's associated with. We have a very, very heavy Scorpio hint in, or leaning in Allie's chart. Lord of the chart is Mars in Virgo up in the 11th, which is a really prosperous friend sign. And I think that part of the issue with Scorpio placements is that they tend to be really picky. But when we have Mars in Virgo in the 11th, that pickiness actually works out really well, because friends also tend to be really picky. And there's good synastry between, oh, I'm picky, you're picky, let's be picky together. It's not necessarily about having all of these friends all of the time, but because Virgo is very, very strict about their requirements and Mars is very hyper-focused, there's an idea of, I know who I like, I know how I want to spend time with, and I'd prefer just to stay around them instead of branching out into new things. Let's keep the social circle small, let's keep it focused, let's keep it passionate, potentially on a warpath, because that Mars brings that competitive energy to any situation. So it wouldn't surprise me if she's involved with some sort of competitive sport. Doesn't necessarily need to be like a physical sport like baseball, but it does need to be some sort of competitive advantage that she shares with her friends, often forming teams and alliances with those that she is uniquely qualified to trust. We have Sun in Cancer, Venus in Cancer, Mercury in Cancer, all up in the 9th house. So part of the ego's identification with higher learning, with foreigners, with travel, the Sun being up in the 9th, as well as Venus adding to the brilliance of it, and Mercury bringing that mind into the 9th. Lifelong learner tendencies, over-identification, like, there will never be a day where Allie doesn't feel like, man, I should really take that class, or man, I should really go back to college, or man, I should really, pick up that next book, or I should really just always trying to learn something, always trying to tap into other cultures, always trying to get a new vantage point when it comes to that Sun, that ego being placed up in the 9th. However, that moon down in Aries in the 6th is ruling that 9th house. Whenever I see the 6th house and the 9th house connected, working for people who travel, working in the travel industry, working in the scholastic industry. So as an example, you take classes, and then transition to teach the classes. Very, very important, especially because that moon is in Aries being ruled by Mars and in Virgo. You will actually be teaching your friends. And that's part of that energy, that sign swap, as it were. The moon is ruling that 9th house of teaching in the 6th house of work, being ruled by that 11th house of friends. So that connection, that trio of connection, you take the class, you develop those friendships, you learn a lot, can't stop learning. You learn so much that you eventually teach, and you end up teaching the peers that you made along the way. That's how it goes. Oh, interesting. We do have Jupiter and Sagittarius retrograde making a trine, an exact trine actually, to that moon in Aries in the sixth. So Jupiter in Sagittarius in the second is normally a very good financial placement. It is retrograde, meaning that it is backwards. So money tends to disappear just as quickly as it is formed. But because it is making a trine to that moon in Aries, the harder Allie works, the more money she makes. And because that second house is directly connected to work, there's that good synergy between effort and income that Allie's chart represents. So as long as she keeps her head down and stops spending so much, that's really where we find a lot of good financial success, is making sure that, again, the pathways for money to leave don't overwhelm her ability to actually work for the money. Let's see what else. Saturn in Pisces retrograde, ruling that third house of siblings and that fourth house of family. Not really a big fan of that. Saturn in Pisces again kind of duplicates that Scorpio energy. It being retrograde, financial issues concerning parents. That's a big thing because Saturn tends to be restrictive. It's being ruled by Jupiter. Both of them are retrograde, kind of parents and money issues all the way. Saturn ruling the fourth house of family we just talked about. Although there may be all the love in the world, the love is perceived as toxic or is not received. That's a big thing. Also taking care of siblings' kids, because we've got that third house of parenting and children connected to that third house of siblings. That could be a thing. But the North Node, South Node axis, like, Allie's already learned how to do relationships. She gets that. She understands what it means to be with people. She gets it. But that North Node is in the first house of self. So back to that idea of the personality being really important, and more friendships instead of intimate relationships being the focal point of Allie's chart. Okay. So we've got one more chart and just under 5 minutes to do it before we hit an hour. Let's go to Fatima. Okay, Fatima was born 7:30 a.m. in Madeira. We need to be careful because the ascendant is encroaching a little bit on the edge of that sign. So if 7:30 a.m. isn't the exact time, we need to be more specific with that. I'd say about 15 minutes prior, and the ascendant would totally shift. So we have, if this is the correct birth time, we have Mercury in Gemini at 0 degrees on the ascendant, which is really, really great. I really think that Fatima has a great gift for knowledge. She has a great gift for communication. Mercury rules the 3 M's: magic, medicine, and money. And so when we look at Gemini being the lord of her chart in its own sign, as well as conjunct the ascendant, an over-identification with the Mercury archetype, working with Mercury as well spiritually, ruling travel, monetary exchange, again, healing, communication, the arts, singing, or verbalization like poetry, things like that, very, very important for Fatima's chart. We do have that sun in Taurus in the 12th, so the ego is hidden. The ego is also surrounded by Venus and Mars. So there might be gender issues that come up in the chart, specifically because whenever I see Mars and Venus co-present within the same house, the idea of masculine and feminine energy becomes a focal point of the chart, not necessarily clinging to gender norms, being surrounded by people who identify as non-gender, as non-binary, that type of stuff, working with themes like bisexuality. But the theme of that sun being in the 12th and being hidden and self-sabotage being a part of Fatima's chart, also really, really important. So I think Fatima's got some deep dive stuff to do when it comes to exploring that 12th house of hidden enemies, because she's put her sun there in Taurus, but Venus is also here in Taurus ruling the sun. There's a lot of hidden potential in Fatima's chart if she would just kind of be able to equip that that GoPro with a flashlight and really kind of delve into that space of hidden enemies and work with kind of the shadow to expose some of those really nicer qualities that she's put away. Other people might think that they're not appropriate, but let me tell you, because you've got Venus and Taurus here ruling the sun, Fatima, what other people tell you is bullshit. And what the stars are telling you is that you should go for it and you should be who you are and you should really open up and embrace what the stars have in your chart, because there's a lot of goodness that I think you've put in the shadows that we need to excavate. Yeah, so that's fun. Especially because we've got that Venus in Taurus also ruling that fifth house. There is a little bit of a conflict between children potentially, again, passing away at an early age, or children being very, very difficult for Fatima, because Venus is ruling her fifth house, but Venus is in that house of hidden enemies. We also have the South Node in Libra here. So children and parenting tends to be a big, big energy suck for Fatima. Should children be a part of the picture, she might find it very difficult in raising them. We do have the moon. The moon is in Virgo, as well as Pluto and Uranus down in the fourth, being ruled by Mercury in the first. That's fun. But the moon is squaring the ascendant. So feelings about family are tricky because family wants you to be something that you're not. Again, these are the themes in the chart. I think that a lot of questions of self, a lot of questions of being accepted, a lot of questions of finding a new tribe, really, because that North Node is in Aries, conjoining that Saturn ruled by Mars in the 12th. Like, you should really be, I don't want to say family is untrustworthy, because they're only doing their best. But the idea that they make you feel constantly emotionally compromised, and that the feelings that you have when you're with your family directly conflict with who you are, Fatima. We need to understand that blood is not necessarily always thicker than water. And the people that you have in your family dynamic, although you might have an obligation to them and you might find a certain amount of emotional recharge when you're with them, we also need to work on your ego. We also need to work on your self-esteem. We also need to work on your sense of self. And that sense of self is going to be elsewhere. We need to find a social tribe that's a little bit more accepting of you, that's a little bit more engaging, a little bit more energetic, a little bit more active, as opposed to that Virgo fourth house energy, which tends to be a little bit nitpicky, tends to be a little bit overly complicated, tends to be a little bit prudish, would be a good way to say it. And that's a big part of your chart, because I think reforming the family will come down the line. You have Pluto here retrograde in the fourth, so around 50 we're going to find you re-entering the family dynamic and potentially creating your own family, maybe stepping up to that matriarch patriarch role, and assuming the head and saying, hey, look, this is how we're going to do things differently, because the way that the family has treated me in the past has not been great, and we need to tweak the social dynamics of the bloodline, as it were. Because you've got Neptune. You've got Neptune and Scorpio retrograde in the 6th, being ruled by Mars and Taurus in the 12th. Healthcare is definitely a field that you would succeed in, especially hospice care, working with those who are dying, working in a hospital setting, working in a psychological setting as well, because you have that Mercury on the ascendant, allowing you to master the mind, allowing you to really tap into mental faculties in a very real way, Fatima. I think that you would be very successful in that department of healthcare. Anything that deals with the psyche, anything that deals with mental processing, and potential trauma as well, because Scorpio is involved in the 6th. Jupiter in the 3rd. Yeah, Jupiter in the 3rd. Let's talk about that. So you have Jupiter in the 3rd in Leo, which gives that really abundant, gaudy energy to that 3rd house of communication, of the mind, of teaching. And Jupiter is ruling that 10th house of success. So I think that again, we talked about this in another chart. One of the things that you might find very therapeutic, Fatima, is to overcome your personal story and then educate others based on your life experience. Turning that pain, turning that hiddenness, turning that dysfunction into a teaching tool for others is a very popular route in therapy. And I think that you would be uniquely qualified to do that because you have a lot to say and you have a really great way of saying it. When you speak, you command the room, that Jupiter in Leo. People can't stop looking at you when you're on stage. If we can just get you on stage with that sun in the 12th being hidden, minimizing your ego, we need to work on the self-esteem to help you realize that your story is valuable and it is something that people need to hear. And we need you now more than ever to stand up for yourself and really reclaim that sense of identity that so many people could learn from. So yeah, good stuff. Great chart to leave off on. Thank you, everybody who jumped on. I appreciate you, everybody who is commenting, watching on Instagram, Facebook. As always, this video will then be put on the YouTube channel, the Scorpio Rising Astrology YouTube channel. I will put the link in the comments for this live stream, or you can just view it on the page. If you would like to submit your chart for the live stream, feel free to send your birth date, place, and exact birth time to me, and I will add you to the queue. Please spell out the month and the day. Do not just give me 11/6, because I don't know if that's November 6th or June 11th. Definitely spell that out for me. If you would like to book a consult, feel free to go to scorpiorisingastrology.com, my website. You can find the consult request form, as well as online classes if you would like to learn astrology. And if I read for you and you really enjoyed it, or you're learning a lot from the casts, anything is greatly appreciated tip-wise, and you can always PayPal Sam at scorpiorisingastrology.com. I'll do this again tomorrow. We've got a lot of charts in queue. I'm really enjoying the live streams. Thank you for indulging my Astro-Babble. And now I get to say my favorite phrase: may the stars be ever in your favor.